Hey, Composite Gloves here, and I am wearing a hat. Today we're going to be talking about dynamic panning and stagnant panning. So I have a couple of moments in here where I am moving my panning around. As you can see, panning automation. If we come down here, panning automation. And there's another one. It escapes me. I'm doing a couple other tricks. Oh, panning automation. There it is. So those are the three ones. You kind of want to be selective on the sounds you do this with. We're going to talk about what sounds make sense to pan, which ones don't, and then also stagnant panning, which is really pretty straightforward. So let's go ahead and give this a quick listen. I'm going to play up to like around here-ish and then stop. This is The Hand That Feeds by Nine Inch Nails. I was asked to do a remix for a school project. So this is what I came up with, and here you go. All right, so that is that. And let's take a look at the panning. So the idea with this intro was that I was going to start out and get mono, or start out mono-ish and then get wider and wider and wider. And then right before the climax, I'm going to squeeze the spectrum into this itsy bitsy band and also make it mono. So it's like, and then at this moment right here, when you play this loud, it's like boom, like just bang, and it's stereo again, like glorious stereo. Now the dynamic panning though is sort of some interesting moves. So we know that we have stereo to play with. That's what we generally mix in. And so stereo simply means, now there's something called true stereo and there's something called well, I guess it's a little complicated. We'll just call it fake stereo. So fake stereo is when you take a mono thing and essentially you make it stereo. You didn't record it as it would actually sound in a space. True stereo is when you use something like a stereo miking technique like XY or Blumline or something, and it's going to accurately capture what that sound sounds like in the actual space. So it's realistic. It captures it. And we could get into stereo miking all day long, but this is in a miking course. We are talking about mixing. So I like to take things that are usually treated as stagnant panning, meaning you pan them one direction and leave them there. I like to move them around just a touch. And there's various reasons I like to do this. First off, I think it's interesting. Second off, depending on the content, the frequency content, your panning may matter less or more, which is something we can get to. And then the third one is, you just saw, you can use it to create dynamic movements where things sound wider and then all of a sudden they get like, you can use it to create musical impacts, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So we can create this sort of wide vision here and then bang right here, just this tiny itsy bitsy thing, and then back to big. So we have a couple options. I am doing a couple other tricks. That is what you see with the stereo shaper. This delay actually is not one of those tricks, but it sort of plays a role in this. So we're not going to talk about those. We're going to talk about those much later in the series when we get to delay effects, but they can be used in very handy dandy ways to create stereo images as well, but it's done a different way. If you're really curious, you can go look up the Haas effect in the critical listening series, or maybe it's up already and you can just skip ahead in the series to go look at that. Now, we have here a couple of movements of panning. And when you pan something, well, that's not panning, this is panning. When you pan something, there are different pan laws. And I was actually surprised to find out that some of the instructors, they're like really old school, so they kind of just did whatever the console they worked with did. So they weren't like super familiar, but like the upper level instructors were like, they knew about this stuff. So if you hit F10 and you go to where is it? Oh, here it is, project, and you go to advanced, and you see we have panning law, circular and triangular. And I was reading on the Loop Talk forums, they might get rid of this, but I hope they don't. It's kind of an interesting deal. I mean, it wouldn't really matter. Basically, I keep it on circular. This only really matters when you are going to be changing where this thing is. You're going to be automating the panning. So what's the difference between circular and triangular, and why doesn't it matter? Well, if we take a sound, like let's say we have this sound on 63, unless this is the sound I am also moving. Oh, nope, it's the one next to it. Okay, cool. You also notice I did break down and automate one fader. I try to keep them inside the channels, and you'll notice there's a lot of volume automation in this one, which is important to that build. So this hat loop, though, if we play it, and then it's already got a stereo. It's already in stereo. As we can see, the left is slightly softer than the right. And also, we should cover stereo cues real quick. This is covered extensively in the critical listening series, which I'm assuming you've watched or at least looked through. And we know that in order for it to sound in order for us to localize where the sound is, we use a couple tricks. There are two main ones though. There's interaural timing cues, timing differences, and there's interaural intensity differences. And so the timing difference, obviously, one sounds before the other, and that's that delay thing I was talking about. And so you can go check out the Haas effect and see some cool ways of using it. And then the other one is the intensity. When we use panning, we are using the intensity difference. So we're creating a stereo image. This allows us to say, oh, the sound is not all in the middle. We see some of it's over there, some of it's over there. It creates the illusion of a space to our brain. And depending on how you do this, if you do it skillfully or well, you can make a mix sound really big, or it make it sound like each thing exists in its own little space, and you're able to easily differentiate things. Sometimes you want it to be the opposite. Sometimes you want things to blur together and mix, so you may do very minimal panning and then pan later. Totally depends on the effect you want to do. So here, if I pan it though and then automate it, let's get a mono thing going here. So I'm gonna go ahead and go to my projects. Or you know what would be really simple is if we just use a citrus. Okay, so here's a citrus, and right now the panning law is circular. So if I pan it, and if we were to look at this at the same time, so we're gonna be looking at this guy. If I pan it, check it out. Oh, whoops, this isn't in default. Let's put it in default. All right, cool. So we have same level in both. It's mono. FL is a little weird because it always shows you stereo, but it's the same out both sides. So for our purposes right now, it's mono. And now what we're going to do is if we move it to the left, you will notice that the signal will actually receive a small increase in gain. So let me play sound. A little softer. Okay. It did not just pan to the left, it increased in gain. I'll do that again. If we move it, you hear that too. So you might be saying, what's the deal with that? Why does it increase in gain when you pan it to one side or the other? The answer is it's circular panning. You see, when you move it around, if we were to do triangular panning, if we go into here and change it to triangular, it will not increase in gain. It will stay consistent. You see, it does not go above. But when it's in the middle, it sounds louder, and that's because we have two channels doing the same thing. And so they boost the sides a little bit when you pan them because they want it to sound consistent across the field. So I recommend, for that reason, staying on circular panning. Circular panning will keep your signal sounding consistent even when you pan it. So that's the advantage to circular panning. You could try triangular. Maybe it's going to create holes or effects in the way you want when you're panning. I guess theoretically it can make it sound a little more like the sides would sound like they're farther away, I guess, because they're softer. I don't know. It depends on the content you put there. So I leave it on circular just for the reason that it sounds consistent. The reason why it doesn't matter if you automate it is because if we move it over here and then play it, right? Oh, that's a little loud. Okay, we were clipping. So right now it's coming out that side, right? And the reason it only matters if you automate it is because if it's going to stay there and you're going to be playing that level, well, then you just adjust your gain, right? We don't care about anything else. You just adjust your gain. You leave it there. It's good. And that's static panning. And so you'll forever receive signal from over there. Versus if you had it moving, then this matters. And of course, I just said that I like things moving. A couple reasons why I like things moving. Well, let's talk about static just a touch more. So some people will pan instruments according to either drummer perspective or audience perspective. So like, for example, your rack toms, the way you pan them, are you going to pan them so that it feels like you're the drummer when you listen back, or are you going to pan it so you feel like you're the audience? I hear audience more commonly than performer. Not that it really matters. It's just a different panning. You do whatever you want, you know? You can pan it in ways that no one else would ever see coming. Also, when you're working with things that are already in stereo, it gets a little complicated you could think of this as sort of just panning it to the left or to the right, but you're really adjusting the balance of samples. And oh yeah, by the way, plugins generally use circular panning. I have not like looked up like all plugins. I'm sure some use triangular, but a plugin may have a different protocol than what your DAW uses. But I believe they standardize the use of circular panning as the panning law. But anyways, if you look at like the Iris 2 synth manual from Isotope, they tell you that if you put a stereo signal in there, you're going to be adjusting the balance. So there's actually some panning moves you can't do. And that's just because of the way they deal with stereo signals. And Pro Tools, if you got a stereo signal, instead of panning hard left, hard right, you could just say, hey, send the first channel of audio to the left speaker and the second channel of audio to the right speaker by just changing the outputs. So you have different options here. Now FL, you just blend it like this or like that. So if we take something that was stereo, like for example, this guy, we see that we have a difference in signal, right? So we can use him as an example. So if we move him, and let's say we take him to the left, it pretty much works the way you would expect. Okay, so let's talk about dynamic panning. The reason why I like dynamic panning is sometimes it feels a little more realistic. You'll often see, and I sometimes do this, I don't do it as much anymore, but you have plugins like Fruity Pan-O-Matic, and you can use an LFO to move the panning back and forth between two speakers. And you might be going, why would you ever want to do something like that? Well, I like it, like, for example, a lot of people have their kick drum and their snare drum coming straight down the middle. But, you know, now the kick drum has a beater, so that's going to be really consistent. And it depends on how realistic you, like, want to be, I suppose. But, for example, the drummer may hit the snare drum in a slightly different spot. So what I'll do is I'll pan it. I'll put this, like, I'll put automation like this, but it'll be super tiny automation, like itsy bitsy automation. And this itsy bitsy of automation will simulate hitting it in a slightly different spot. And so it creates subtle variances. Anyways, that's my theory on it. And I think it sounds really cool. I like it. It feels a little more organic. So I do things like that. Now, things like this, I'm just trying to create image and room. And so it's mostly an interest move. So I move it. And for example, this is the hi-hat loop 2, which is this guy. And if we move him, so you see it moves over here and then it's going to move back down. And there's so much stuff going on right here that it just helps create room for things that weren't coming through before. If I'm not affecting them and they stay the same, they'll actually come through a little bit more. So you have a little bit easier time picking things out. You're like, oh, that's what's over there. And then as it moves back, your brain is like taking care of that. It's like it's put it in a filing cabinet and now you don't need to worry about it. It's purely for interest. Now, this high frequency stuff will be a bit easier to pan than low frequency stuff. So you can get away with more extreme pan moves. Why is that? Well, if you get a subwoofer, sub frequencies, like low frequencies, generally don't care where you put them in a room. I mean, if you put them in a corner or something, they're going to sound really loud. But like you can put it in most places in a room. That's because those frequencies are so huge that they just sound like they're everywhere. So panning a low frequency is not mega effective. Now, when you're wearing headphones, the experience changes slightly because if you have one headphone emitting noise and the other one's not, then you're going to be like, oh my gosh, definitely sub on this side. But if you were listening in an environment over some speakers, way, way, way less noticeable. Like it's a lot harder to tell. So panning, you can get away with bigger pan moves with bass, but because of the rise and headphone listeners, you want to also be slightly careful for those people. A lot of people will make their bass mono for this reason. So they'll open up something like we haven't covered stuff like this, but they'll open up something like a multi-band anything. They'll go to the low band, so the low frequencies, they have stereo separation. And we'll look at how this thing works a little bit later. Well, it'll be covered in a similar way that the delay is covered because you can use like phase shifts and different delays. Really cool. So what we're going to do is we're going to go 100% merged. And now my bass on this channel will be merged. So it's basically mono because panning something that low wouldn't be that much of a difference. However, there are things that happen. So for example, all the frequencies, all the audio coming through one channel, like I'm panning the saw layer here. So if we go over here and play this, so I'm panning this guy and he's moving around. So if we just solo those, what's going to happen is it's not going to make huge movements, even though if we blow this up, they are kind of big movements, but they're actually not that big. But That was a contradiction. Anyways, because they're low frequencies in a space, it's going to be less noticeable, but it will change the way things sum in the different speakers. So because that frequency is moving, and again, I'm creating that room occasionally. So with lower stuff, you can get away with like things like that, which can help give clarity to your mix. So a lot of times, sometimes it's a level war. And of course, we set our levels first, but you'll find yourself, you will adjust your levels a second time after you set your panning, because once your panning is set, then you have all this extra room. Like you've got way more room, so you can make things sound bigger. But you also want to be careful because now you can toss in things like, if you want to do filter moves, you can change your volume that way. You have the reverb, you have delay moves, you have compression, and you can do parallel processing, all stuff we're going to talk about later. So this becomes just a really cool tool that gives a lot of room that is totally underutilized by a lot of people. A lot of people will stick stuff on there. Well, not a lot of people, just new people, I guess. People who haven't done a lot of this. So doing stuff like this can really help your mix just sound bigger and make room for more cool effects. You notice I do this also with the atmosphere, and the same idea. And it's an atmosphere, so it kind of makes sense that it moves a little bit, that it breathes a little bit. And some of this stuff is already in the sample. Like I'm pretty sure. Yeah. You see there are differences in the left and right, and it already moves back and forth, but it's more or less consistent. They're not very large differences. So by changing this, I can make room for other layers in the sound, because you see I actually automate the atmosphere on and off at moments that I think are musically impactful as far as the volume is concerned. So this is me setting levels, but also being creative at the same time because I was remixing it. And then over here, you could see that like these guys, there's a filter movement that's also happening with that bass layer. So if we just mute these three, this is also going on. So that combined with our cool atmospheric noise plus the atmospheric panning, see, that's cool. You're just creating this cool atmosphere. And then when you unmute everything, it's sort of back there, but it just creates this sense of placement. So that's, anyways, those are some thoughts about panning. What advice do you have about panning? Now, like, you're going to hear things like this. Like, people usually, it's pretty standard to put your snare and your kick straight down the middle. Depending on the genre, this may change. And so that's another thing. These things definitely change with genre because you're trying to accomplish some other sonic character. I'm speaking mostly in this case as like a pseudo EDM type of thing. So yeah, so like for example, your toms, you may leave those statically panned, or you may do that subtle itsy bitsy panning just for the variety of reasons I just spoke about. But you may leave them. I know lots of people who just leave them there. I personally think it contributes. It's just a different sound. That's all it is. And so, you know, kick snare, some people keep their overheads. They're not always true stereo. Sometimes they're just two mics that are stuck up there. And so you can pan those in interesting ways and find something that's pleasing to you. There's a lot of opinions that go into this, and you could have done a specialty, like you could have done a stereo technique, and then you could deliberately mess with it and do something that's totally not stereo. So yeah, if you have any extra advice, comments, things you thought I left out, go ahead, leave those below. Subscribe, support me on Patreon, and I do private lessons if you are interested. And have a blessed day.